Our sanctuary is full of many symbols today. The beautiful eagle feathers that the children have colored and that Misha and her crew assembled for us. The cedar brought from a local garden, as well as the older cedar carved into the salmon, Carrie Newman's artwork, and the beautiful traditional flute that Carrie brought from the States. We have all these symbols that really remind us of what a heartbreaking month it has been for us here. And a painful irony, this is the time we are celebrating Indigenous history and culture, and we are confronted with the harsh realities of our past. Can't say it enough that we offer our prayers and condolences to all the families and the many generations impacted by the loss of children's lives at residential schools. We know that some people were surprised to hear about these unmarked graves at Kamloops. Some of us in this congregation or in this city may not have known of the depth of the involvement of the United Church in the residential schools. In 1925, at the time of union, across the country, the United Church assumed responsibility for 12 schools, and the last one did not close until 1969. Here in British Columbia, there were 5 schools, residential schools. Port Alberni is perhaps the best known one to us as a congregation. It was run by the United Church of Canada. But there are 4 others, and I'd like to just name them so that we're all getting that new information. We're being asked to learn, and so we can assume nothing. Let's start at the beginning. I'm starting with the Kokalitsa home and then the Kokalitsa Institute. That's from the 1880s until the 1940s. It was operated originally by the missionary women of the Methodist Church, and then, of course, after Union, became United Church. It's on the shores of Luckakuk Creek in Sardis, British Columbia. On the island was a Howsit, which operated from the 1890s to just after the turn of the century as a day school and an informal boarding school, and then a boarding school until 1940. It originally had been owned by the Presbyterians. It was also part of their Women's Missionary Society. And that's on the southeast end of Flores Island in Clayoquot Sound. Alberni, Port Alberni School was opened in 1892. Didn't finally close until 1973. Originally, it was a Presbyterian church school and mission, but of course became United. That's just, you know where Port Alberni is. Then there was Elizabeth Long Memorial Home, which was in Kitimat on the mainland from 1894 until 1941. Originally, it had been part of the WMS and the Methodist Church. And you know it's up near, south of Prince Rupert. And finally, Port Simpson, Lax Kw'alaams, on the north coast of BC, north of Prince Rupert. It closed early by comparison. The girls' school closed in 1948, and the boys in 1914. So that's the backbone, the building things, building blocks. You might have been a part of this church, but I wouldn't assume it. So let me tell you that in 1986, the United Church issued its apology for that involvement and began the process of trying to reconcile the wrongs and move into right relations with Indigenous peoples. We have come a long way since 1996. We have a long way to go. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created with the purpose of documenting the history and the lasting impact of the residential school system. I was one of the people who went to the Vancouver visit of the TRC and sat as a witness and listener to heartbreaking stories. The TRC concluded with the 94 steps of calls to action. So, a call to action. It's said by wise people that whenever you do something like this, present a social issue, present a call to justice within the church, it's only fair to ask people to do something, that there is an action that results. So I'm going to have a couple to suggest. This first one is this. About a fortnight ago on CBC Checkup, on the AM radio, an Indigenous educator proposed that at 2:15 we have a minute silence. Maybe you could set your clock to go off at 2:15 and have a minute silence. Now the moderator, Richard Bott, a very Reverend Richard Bott, also has a suggestion of what we could do as an action to take as we begin again in a new reality of this time of discovery of the graves of children. And so I'm pleased to invite him to our screen now.
I am a minister who is a descendant of white European colonists. The first time I stood in front of a community of faith and acknowledged the people and the territory upon which we were worshiping was just after the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out. Members of that community of faith had gone to the Truth and Reconciliation gatherings when it met here in Vancouver to be witnesses as colonizer descendants to the histories that were shared there. The stories of Indigenous peoples' experiences at the hands of colonizer institutions, and the multi-generational devastation of those experiences were spoken, heard, and written down. L'Église unie du Canada a aussi fait partie de ces institutions coloniales, non seulement du fait qu'elle dirigeait 15 pensionnats au pays, mais également en partageant une façon de penser et des théologies qui les ont conquis. Cette mentalité de paternalisme et de racisme systémique qui existe encore aujourd'hui. As a denomination, we are part of the colonizer story of cultural genocide in this land. That should never be forgotten. No matter what work we as a church have done or are doing to live in right relations with the Indigenous peoples of this land, it will always be a part of our story. It can never be forgotten. It must never be forgotten, both in times of lament and in times of celebration. Finding of 215 bodies of Indigenous children unrecognized by the system on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School cannot be a surprise to anyone who has read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or anyone who has listened to the stories of residential school survivors. It should be a horror. It should be a terrible sadness, but it should not be a surprise. Bien que le pensionnat de Kamloops était sous la responsabilité de l'Église catholique romaine, les survivants ont raconté qu'il y a aussi des enterrements anonymes sur les lieux des pensionnats dirigés par l'Église unie du Canada. Those here who are Indigenous, to those who have been affected by the Church's oppressive colonial practices, especially for those who have made their home the United Church of Canada. We as a church seek ways to grieve and act in solidarity against all forms of oppression and white supremacy. Puissent les 96 prochaines années et toutes les autres par la suite être une période de croissance dans la guérison et les relations justes. Un temps où les gestes justes sont posés. Territorial acknowledgements, if they are going to be more than empty words, must be acts of recommitment to right relations with the Indigenous peoples of the lands upon which we live. So, this day, I challenge everyone who is celebrating who we are as the United Church of Canada, gathered in this time to worship God together, to acknowledge the territory upon which you come to this place. And in that acknowledgement, commit yourself to listening, to learning, to understanding to the best of our ability, and then to living out, no matter the cost, the work of right relations with the Indigenous peoples of this land every single day. I am joining in worship today from the traditional, unceded lands of the Coquitlam, the Katzie, the Stolo peoples, in the community I know of as Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. They have lived here and continue to live here, a part of this land for tens of thousands of years before my ancestors came. Je rends grâce pour ce que ces peuples ont été, pour ce qu'ils sont toujours, et je prie chaque jour pour le bien-être de leurs aînés, de leurs enfants et de leur communauté. Upon whose land do you come to worship today? I ask you to say it out loud if you know. If you don't know, I'd ask you to take time after worship to find out. Either way, I'd ask you to make this the first action, and that we take time to learn what the next and the next and the next steps need to be. And then act. Qu'aujourd'hui en soit le commencement.